The content we're going over today is for informational purposes only. So don't go do something that we're showing you today, get yourself hurt. Before you do anything remotely dangerous, go get proper professional training. Well, let's do this. Now we've weakened the webbing in this one spot. As this moves and shifts, and it's gonna start to melt and weaken that webbing. Today, we're discussing the various uses of webbing, what you can use it for, what you shouldn't use it for, and a lot of other information regarding this webbing. So stay tuned. Before we go any further, if you find any of this information on our channel helpful, we would appreciate it if you would subscribe, turn your notifications on so you're notified of any other future videos that we post. And if you find this video helpful, leave us a like. Let us know in the comments below what you liked or what you didn't like. If you have any other feedback or anything to add to it, we'd love to hear from you. So today we're talking about webbing, and we're talking about tubular rescue rated webbing specifically. This tool has many different uses, very versatile, and it's very economical. You can get this stuff for really cheap. So let's start with what the webbing is, what you should be looking for when you're buying webbing, and then we'll jump into some different uses for this. Because webbing is so cheap, I would recommend keeping some of this with you in your medical kit, keep some of this in your car. This is 4,000 pound webbing, so you could even use it to pull your car out of a ditch. But before we go any further, let me say, if you're gonna be using this as utility webbing, pulling a car out of a ditch, or tying off a load in the back of your pickup truck, try to keep that separate from all the stuff you have in your medical bag. If you're using something in your medical bag to be able to move a patient around, you don't want to be dragging a patient, lowering a patient, or moving a patient with webbing that has been cut, abraded, has a bunch of the threads have been cut, and it looks all like a fuzzy rope here. So let's take care of the webbing that we're going to use for any life safety things. If you have webbing that's used for utility purposes, that's fine. Just make sure you mark it as such so that those two don't get confused. So first, let's start with what type of webbing. So here I have 1-inch webbing. That's the width of the webbing. This is rescue rated webbing. So this has a higher rating minimum breaking strength than, say, thin webbing that we would sew on a backpack for molly webbing or something like that. This is also tubular webbing, which means that it's actually double-sided or hollow if I pull this apart. So you can tell there's actually a seam on one side, a fold on one side, seam on the other, and this is actually a hollow piece of webbing. So this is 1-inch tubular webbing. This specific webbing has a minimum breaking strength of 4,000 pounds. Now, that's the minimum breaking strength, so we don't want to be anywhere near that breaking strength when we're hanging off of this. A rule of thumb a lot of people go off of is a 10-to-1 safety ratio or a 15-to-1 safety ratio. So for a 10-to-1 safety ratio, you wouldn't want to exceed 400 pounds. I would probably go with a 15-to-1 or even a 20-to-1 on this particular, so I wouldn't want to dangle any more than 200 or 300 pounds off of a single strand of this webbing. Now, what can you use this for? Well, we can use this for tying a hasty harness on ourselves to be able to rappel or lower ourselves off of something. We can use this as a quick harness on a victim to be able to either drag the victim or carry the victim. We can actually use webbing instead of a rope to be able to rappel off of an object. Now, if you do that over and over, it will wear the webbing out, so don't highly recommend doing that. But in a pinch, it will work, and it is strong enough to support your weight. Before we get into more use cases and specifics on using the webbing, let's go over a few fundamental knots that you're going to need to know when you're tying this webbing. So when we're tying a flat webbing like this, we want all our knots to be fairly flat too. We don't want them to all be twisted up. So when we're tying knots, make sure that it's not all twisted, it's sitting flat. We don't want our knots to get in there and look like a big mess with it all folded over each other. We want everything to be nice and dressed. When we're tying a knot in a rope or webbing, it weakens the strength of the webbing or the rope. All these fibers are strongest when they're all straight in line and they're tensioned like this. If we start putting any twists or any bends in our webbing, those fibers on the outside are stressed more than the fibers underneath, because the ones on the outside are going to have more tension on them. So the weight is not distributed as evenly across all the strands, and so that weakens the webbing or the rope when we do that. So just know, anytime we put a knot or any sort of twist or anything in our rope, it's going to weaken it. So that 4,000 pounds minimum breaking strength, as soon as we tie a knot in there, we're going to decrease that by maybe 20%. So now instead of 4,000 pounds, we're going to be down to 3,200 pounds of a minimum breaking strength, just because we put a knot in the middle of our webbing. To use proper terminology, anytime that this webbing or rope comes back on itself, we call this a bite. So I'm going to use that term as we go throughout this video, so just keep in mind when I say a bite, that is a rope or webbing folded over back on itself. For the most part, the knots we use on webbing are going to be based off of an overhand knot. So let's go ahead and tie an overhand knot. So we're going to simply come around, pull the webbing through, and we have an overhand knot. A couple things to keep in mind. We want this knot to sit flat. We already talked about not having any twists in it. So when we pull this, if I squish this, there's no twisted webbing anywhere in here. It's all flat. It's all sitting like it should with no twists. When we get done, it should look a little bit like a tent or a house or a triangle with a point on one side. Now that we have an overhand knot tied, we're gonna take this piece of webbing and we're gonna loop it together in one big loop. So I'm gonna tie the ends together. So I'm going to now find the other end. I'm gonna feed it right next to this webbing, and I'm going to stick it through, and we're gonna trace back through the knot that was already there. I don't want my tails to end up on the same side, so I actually wanna come opposing this tail. So wherever this tail is, I'm gonna come against that tail, go right in beside it, and we're literally gonna trace the same steps that that other overhand took. So pull this through, wrap it around, and this is gonna go back through this knot. All right, so we've tied the knot, but what about this tail? Well, this tail should be 4 to 5 inches long, so I could get a hand on there, and that will prevent, if there's any slippage of this, we've got a little bit extra before the tail actually goes through. If you're gonna use this for a single use, like a single rappel, 4 to 5 inches would be fine. If we're gonna put this somewhere as an anchor that's gonna be used over and over for multiple people rappelling, I'm gonna wanna go ahead and take a overhand here on this tail and just tie a little safety knot in it. So quick overhand, and that's gonna prevent, if this pulls up any, it's gonna stop in the knot before it actually goes all the way through. So if I have this webbing tied around an object and where I clip into, or my anchor point here, is too far out and I need to shorten it up a little bit, I can simply take this, tie an overhand in it, and now I have an anchor point here that's further up. Now keep in mind, if I clip in here, it'll hold. If I clip in here, it'll hold, but it's also gonna cinch this knot down so tight it's gonna have a hard time getting this back out. So always try to clip above your knot there rather than down here in the bite. If you do, for some reason, have to clip into this bite that's on the end of this webbing, you can stick a carabiner down inside your knot, put it on the spine or the straight part of the carabiner, and now when we load that, we've got a little bit of gap created by this carabiner. When we go to unload this, we can open this up, slide the carabiner out. Now there's some space in there, and that will help us to be able to get this knot taken back out after the fact. All right, so really the only other knot we're ever gonna use with webbing, for the most part, is a frost knot. So a frost knot, what we're gonna do is we're gonna take one end of a webbing and we're gonna stick it under a bite of our webbing here, something like this. All right, so I've got 3 pieces in line. I've got my end piece that's in the middle. I've got a bite that's on the end of my other piece of webbing that goes over top of that one. And now what I'm gonna do is I'm just gonna tie a overhand knot. So I end up with my overhand knot. I've got this little tail that hangs in the middle. These 3 are all stacked on top of each other inside the knot, and now I can use this knot and I can load this, and this is a strong knot. We'll show you a use case for this a little bit later in the video. One thing to keep in mind with knots on webbing, we should always be pulling it in line with the knot, meaning I want to pull this way. My load should be this way. I don't want my load to be this way. Anytime I pull this way, it's pulling the knot apart and stressing these fibers on this webbing past what they really should be. So always keep in mind, if you tie a knot, you want to be pulling in that direction. So if I find an anchor that I want to anchor off of and I tie this webbing around an anchor, I don't want to clip into here as my anchor and have this in line because it's going to pull my knot apart. I instead want to use this part so that everything stays in line. So always double check your knots and make sure that you're pulling and your forces are in line with that knot. So how should we store webbing? Well, my favorite way to store webbing is like you see it right here around my neck. This is a daisy chain. So typically this is a single strand daisy chain. Typically I do a double strand daisy chain. So find the ends of your webbing that you want to store, and we are going to work this back to the middle point. I'm going to start with a loop or a bite at the center point of my webbing. I'm going to reach through, pull this up, make another little loop, reach through, pull this up, another loop. I'm just going to continue that until I use up all of my webbing. When I get to the end, I'm going to take my tail and stick it through my loop, cinch it down, and now my webbing's not going to come apart. I can use this side to clip a carabiner to hang my webbing, and when I need to deploy this, I just take the tail side, pull it through one time, and now my webbing should all play out. And there it is. So this will shorten your webbing so it's not as long and hanging around, and it'll also keep it from getting tangled so you can quickly deploy it and use your webbing. Let's talk about anchors for a minute. So if we need to anchor to a tree or a piece of equipment or a guardrail or something to be able to rappel off of something or to be able to raise a patient up, we're going to want to use some webbing or something to tie an anchor. So the two most simplest forms of an anchor would be a basket and a girth hitch. A basket is simply taking webbing that is tied in a big loop. We're going to loop it around our object, and we're going to bring the ends together. We're going to clip into here. It's a basket. It's as simple as that. If we're going to put a lot of stress and load on this, we may want to double it up and have a second basket with a second set of webbing that we anchor into as well. All right, so second, let's talk about a girth hitch. Now we've taken our basket, we've got our two ends. Take one end and stick it through the other one and then pull it tight. This is our girth hitch. Now this has its uses, but it also is much weaker of an anchor point for two reasons. One, if I set this improperly, I have mechanical advantage that I'm pulling on this space now because I'm actually pulling somewhat like a 2-to-1 on this webbing now. So I'm putting extra force on this bite. And we already talked about anytime you have a bite or a sharp bend in webbing, it weakens it. Well, now we've weakened the webbing in this one spot and we've pulled extra force against here because of this mechanical advantage on this spot. Secondly, not only do we have mechanical advantage, but we also have nylon rubbing on nylon. So as this moves and shifts, you've got nylon that's rubbing on each other, and it's going to start to melt and weaken that webbing. So we want to avoid this at all costs. A girth hitch is great for keeping webbing in place. So if we have to anchor up high on a tree, we can put a girth hitch in, and the more weight we put on it, the tighter it goes, and it holds it in place so it doesn't slide down. If we have to use a girth hitch, let's make sure we're keeping this part of our webbing that we're anchoring to as much in line around the tree as possible. So rather than pulling it over here and pulling against it where we have this extra sharp bend here, let's turn it around on this side of the tree and pull it in line. It's going to be deviated just a little bit as we have pressure on here, but this is a lot more in line and much stronger of a girth hitch than if we slid this to the other side. We can use that girth hitch for many different applications, one of which would be making a step. So now we can make a step around an object or a tree. We can step into that and we can use that to gain access somewhere up much higher. If we need to shorten this up or make a ladder out of this, we can even tie an overhand knot here. And now we have an improvised ladder. I can step here, and then I can step here as well. One of the uses for webbing that we teach firefighters is that you can use this as a step to get out of a window. So if you're inside a building and you need to bail out of a window, let's say it's a high window and you're having a hard time getting over that ledge, you can take this webbing, set it on your hand, set your hand up on the windowsill, and then use this as a step to pull up on. As soon as you bail out of the window, this webbing comes with you and you haven't lost your webbing. So everything we covered so far is just a small part of the things that you can do with webbing. If you are going to purchase webbing, make sure you buy from a reputable source and take care of your webbing, especially if you're going to be using it for hauling or lowering a person. We want to make sure that we don't use the same utility webbing for tying something in a truck bed that we're going to use in our medical kit to be able to move a patient around. We hope you all learned something from this video, and as always, stay vigilant and stay safe.